My name is Jacek Lubecki. It's a Polish name. It spells J-A-C-E-K, first name, and L-U-B-C-K-I, last name, Lubecki. And I'm a professor at Georgia Southern University, associate professor of international studies and political science. I've been teaching here since 2012, and my PhD is from University of Denver. The book was co-written by myself and my colleague, Jim Peterson, professor emeritus of political science at Valdosta State University, so also in Georgia. And the book, as you mentioned, is about defense policies of East Central European countries, so Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, with an emphasis on the post-communist period. But this is also an extensive historical section of the book that talks about history of military and defense issues in the countries under consideration. James is a widely published author on defense issues in Europe, mostly NATO, US foreign policy, US military policy, and he also happens to be an expert on the Czech Republic and Slovakia, actually fluent in both languages, Czech and Slovak, wrote extensively on Czech history, Czech culture, music, and so on and so forth. I happen to be interested in Polish defense policies. Being Polish, I published a couple of articles about it. Naturally, I'm interested in US foreign policy, foreign policies and defense policies of NATO and European countries. So when I met Jim, and that was personally in 2015, he and I very quickly figured out that if we could put our respective expertise together, we can have a very significant monograph written about East Central European defense policies. And we quickly discovered that while there is no shortage really of articles and publications about those countries' defense policies, there isn't a dedicated monograph, paradoxically, in English language or actually any language from which I understand, a book that puts all of those defense policies together in one volume and kind of systematically compares, contrasts them, and creates a conceptual framework for thinking about Polish, Czech, Hungarian, and Slovak defense policies. So many things came together that made us decide to write the book, and Manchester University Press, which is the publisher, was very willing to work with us on the publication of the book. So all of them were kind of late communism, late Cold War defense establishments. So all of them were characterized by subjugation to strategic vision and strategic policies of the Soviet Empire. All of those militaries were clones of sorts of the Soviet military. And all of them underwent kind of cycles of change that had to do with development and history of the Soviet external empire. So all of them were kind of late communist militaries oriented towards fighting as allies a conventional nuclear battle against NATO forces in East Central Europe, roughly. At the same time, we have to understand that what immediately preceded the fall of communism was not militarization, but to the contrary, detente and demilitarization of Europe that has been going on since 1985 of 1986. The coming of Gorbachev to power. There was already an attempt of sorts to demilitarize those countries, at least to an extent, right? In other words, what I'm trying to say is that there's an interesting history and an interesting pattern about those countries in terms of their defense policies under the Soviet regime, in terms of how it kind of converged during the Soviet period. What we also discovered is that actually those countries underwent different patterns of development under communism in terms of defense and military policies. Now, what was unique about Poland, for instance, is that that was the only communist country in the Soviet bloc and perhaps in the world where the military was formally in charge. So not the party, but the military. When Poland declared martial law in December 1981, what was officially said, by the way, I remember it very much as a 15-year-old child living in Poland at the time, is that power is in the hands of a military committee of national salvation. And that was officially announced on state TV. And, you know, for people who are experts on communist ideology and communist militaries, that's stunning. I mean, in a Marxist-Leninist country, what's officially announced, it's not the party which is in charge, but the military system, by the way, acting under the heading of patriotic salvation. So something extraordinary. Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia had nothing even close to that in terms of their history under communism. So again, you know, one thing that we notice during the communist period is this Polish exceptionalism, how Poland has, you know, really different pattern of political development already under communism compared to the rest of the countries of the bloc. And then, you know, one of the things that we're going to argue in the book is that difference between Poland and the rest of the countries under consideration is pronounced in the post-communist period. Poland is just different. Jim and I adopted a framework, kind of general conceptual framework of convergence and divergence when thinking about those countries. So the 90s is the period of convergence. All of those countries deal with the legacy of communism, reject it, demilitarize to some extent, and then very quickly start seeking membership in NATO. And they all do it fairly aggressively and following fairly similar steps. So yes, there is convergence, and convergence involves dismantling of communist-era militaries. Convergence involves institutional changes that make those countries' military and defense policies follow the Western norms in this respect, norms of liberal Western countries. And all of them aggressively seek membership in NATO. And by the way, all of them step up to some extent their military spending in the period immediately preceding their membership in NATO, and this is to partially at least modernize their respective militaries and fit into NATO standards that, by the way, the paradox of seeking membership in Western liberal defense institutions is that on the one hand, the West means demilitarizations. It's essentially, it's no longer the communist imperial pattern of fairly militarized societies, but they also, NATO also comes with obligations regarding a certain level of cooperation, interoperability, modernization of armed forces, and so on and so forth. So those countries actually have to step up to some extent their military spending prior to membership in NATO. So all of them do it along the same lines. The 90s is the period of convergence. And by the way, the 21st century, following 9/11, is kind of the period of divergence between those countries within a broader pattern of convergence. So for instance, all of them participate in NATO and US operations outside of Europe, Afghanistan and Iraq, and so on and so forth, but to a different extent. And again, what's visible is this Polish exceptionalism, the difference between Poland and the remaining three countries of the region. For me, and I would love for you to interview Jim also, but for me personally, studying Hungary was a little bit of a surprise. Big part of the explanatory framework in the book is political culture and the past. Because those countries had a certain past, communist and pre-communist past, we expect certain strategic cultures to be embedded. And even though Hungary is a fairly small country, I expect that a strategic culture influenced by Hungarian imperial past. Hungary might be a small country, but it has a magnificent past in terms of the country being something of a great power in East Central Europe. So I expect that a well-funded defense policy that reflects a certain level of militarization of the culture and the society, reflects Hungarian concerns about the neighborhood, and perhaps some residual fear of instability in the part of the world where Hungary is. Anyway, I expect that Hungary to be like Poland. And by the way, it's kind of a usual pattern in comparative politics and study of East Central Europe to expect commonality between Hungary and Poland. The notion is that the countries, for whatever reason, have certain parallel elements or similar elements of local culture. They had fairly similar past, and this similarity is even reflected in kind of popular commonsensical perceptions in the region. There's a saying, Poles and Hungarians, two brethren are. And today we see the type of local regimes that we see in Poland and Hungary following roughly similar pattern of development. So there was a natural expectation that Poland and Hungary also have similar defense policies. And what I discovered was precisely the reverse. Right? In other words, Poland and Hungary could not be more divergent in terms of their commitment, for instance, to military spending or pursuit of robust, well-funded military and defense policies. Roughly, Poland is an outlier in the whole region and even Europe-wide in terms of well-funded defense efforts. And Hungary is the outlier in the other side. Together with Spain, it is the member of NATO that has spent the least on its military in terms of percentage of GDP, definitely. But you know, there's more to that. So in other words, actually no similarity between Poland and Hungary. And naturally, then there's a question why Poland and Hungary have followed such divergent paths of defense policy development since the fall of communism. So, by the way, Orban comes to power in 2010. So by now we have almost a decade of Orban, Orban's hegemony. And one of the kind of interesting facts I discovered is, number one, at least since 2001, Hungary systematically diminished its defense spending to the point of starving its military of necessary resources or any efforts to modernize. And Orban comes to power in 2010, so before the recent Ukrainian crisis, and he simply continues the preceding policies of cutting military spending and vastly under-resourcing any type of military efforts by Hungary. The response to Russian interference in Ukraine and the war and so on and so forth is equally non-existent, in a sense that pretty much, so number one, there's some talk about increasing defense spending, but very little reality behind it. But number two, Putin officially proclaimed Russia and Putin to be a friend of Hungary, rhetorically at least, opened the issue of Transcarpathian Ukraine, which is historically part of Hungary, and rose the question of Hungarian minority in Transcarpathia. So borderline sided with Putin against Ukraine, right? Pointing out that Ukraine has minority problems, has problems with suppressing minorities, not just the Russians in eastern Ukraine, but Hungarians in Transcarpathia. And the rhetoric of stepping up defense spending in Hungary, number one, there's no clear strategic thinking about it. Against whom? According to Orban, Russia is not an enemy, but a friend. Perhaps Ukraine is. Also, according to Orban, the real enemy is the unarmed Muslim refugees from Syria, wherever. And to defend against them, you don't need military spending. You don't defend yourself against Muslim refugees with tanks. You do it by, hiring more border guards. And by the way, this is precisely what Orban did. So in the reality of vastly under-resourced military, suddenly money was found to create a completely new border troop formation that Orban created from scratch, perceiving the existing customs enforcement officials and even Hungarian military to be insufficient to defend the border, so to speak, against the refugees. So suddenly resources were found for this overpriced new border troop formation that, by the way, has no military value in terms of actual hardcore defense policies. So again, Hungary has really different strategic priorities. if any, because again, what you have behind it still is vastly under-resourced, underfunded military establishment, which, by the way, with some 20,000 total force and perhaps 10,000 active troops, Hungary is clearly not capable of defending its own borders against any form of conventional military attack from any side whatsoever. It's not just the military is tiny, it's also, by and large, has had no decent procurement programs since mid-1990s in terms of at least land equipment and so on and so forth. And by the way, going back to my other comparative case, Poland, is precisely the reverse reality. But again, I would expect that this war goes primarily it's between Poland and Ukraine. I wouldn't expect much to happen between Ukraine and Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, because just like Hungary, by the way, prominent political figures both in Slovakia and the Czech Republic expressed sympathy towards Putin, and policy of Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary all has been kind of confused and incoherent with respect to Russian behavior in Ukraine. Briefly, the pattern that we see is as follows in the book. On the one hand, there's official NATO policy, which is firmly anti-Russian and involves measures of deterrence and reassurance against Russia. And formally, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia all are part of that policy and all participated formally in stepped-up efforts to build up military forces, deter Russia, have joint exercises aimed primarily against potential for Russian aggression. And all of them, by the way, joined the sanctions regime against Russia following the events in Ukraine. So that's one side of the policy, kind of bureaucratic, routine politics, and all those countries are very much members of that strain of policy. On the other hand, again, in Hungary primarily, but also in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, you had the highest level pronouncements coming from leaders of those countries that expressed sympathy to the Russian position, that proclaimed high and wide that Russia is not the aggressor and not the problem, that proclaimed high and wide that Ukraine invited the aggression and Ukraine itself is a problem country, and that's Orban, right? That's expressed, almost strategic sympathy towards Russia, and generally, made policy statements and follow certain policies that go directly contrary to those routine policies that I just delineated, that Hungary also followed. So the strategic incoherence of Hungarian position couldn't be greater. And I think the important thing that the readers should know is that both policies are happening at the same time. And trying to figure out which of those policies is real, so to speak, is well-nigh impossible. So should we believe Orban, or should we believe what Hungarian military establishment actually does by cooperating with NATO and training for potential for Russian aggression in the region? Both things are happening, both things are real. And by the way, behind it, there's another reality, which is very under-resourced Hungarian military, that whatever the policy is not capable of doing much in the first place. So I guess it's a third strain of policy, which is roughly expresses the notion we Hungarians don't really give a damn about our defense. It's not the problem. We are not the solution. We are not a major country. We don't care. All of them move dramatically. Those are very different military establishments and very different realities. But they also continue to some extent what was the reality under communism. Polish military is the best funded and the most politically supported by the respective public and regime in the region. That's Poland. And I argue in the book that continues a pattern already created under communism. Another paradox of the whole Polish case, so I mentioned the martial law. It is perhaps less well known that a recent, well, not so recent, but definitely post-communist survey of Polish public opinion showed that the majority of Poles today still retrospectively approves the General Jaruzelski's action in December 1981 of launching the martial law. And by the way, Polish military was a highly trusted institution under communism and after communism. Polish military was highly funded under communism and after communism, right? Poland is a fairly militarized in terms of political culture nation with a fairly high sense and perception of external threat. And Poland continues to see itself as a medium-sized, strategically significant country that deserves to have a well-funded military and vigorous, robust defense policy that seeks to carve out Poland's independent role in the strategic relationships in Central Europe. That's kind of what we see. Hungary doesn't see itself clearly, at least in terms of actual behavior in those terms. Hungarian military was underfunded under communism and continues to be underfunded after communism. Hungarian people, as expressed through surveys of public opinion, hold their military in really low esteem and think that any type of military spending is an unnecessary luxury in the current reality, perhaps extracted by the US or NATO allies who want to see evidence of NATO solidarity. And I imagine in Hungarian perception, it's about senseless wars like Afghanistan that serve no purpose and simply waste Hungarian lives and money. Clearly, Hungarian public doesn't see well-funded, robust defense policy as any type of priority for Hungary. They are concerned about other issues, such as economic issues, or perhaps the quote-unquote Muslim invasion, or whatever it is. But the priorities of Hungary are the opposite of Polish priorities in terms of defense policies. And I imagine Slovakia and Czech Republic, and again, those are Jim Peterson's case, are somewhere in between those realities. And by the way, those countries each follow their own very specific patterns of political development that are convergent with those other countries, but also divergent in very interesting ways. And this is precisely what the book is about. Yet there was this dramatic incertitude when communism collapsed. So by the way, this notion that those countries should move and join NATO alliance and become part of kind of Western defense and economic, that wasn't necessarily a given. There was a couple of years, there was a short period where there was real incertitude in terms of what those countries should do in terms of putting themselves in some type of broader framework of defense policies. So, for instance, there was this briefly discussed idea, what about if those countries form their own bloc for mutual defense? To some extent, that revived an interwar. So between World War I and World War II, there was this Polish strategy to build a bloc of countries between Germany and the Soviet Union, roughly, as some type of kind of self-sufficient military bloc. So there was this discussion. There was also the notion that since the Warsaw Pact dissolved, maybe NATO should dissolve. And East Central European countries should put their trust in all European or even global defense institutions. Kind of disappearance of war. So there was lots of chaos, but also lots of incertitude in terms of what course of strategic and defense policies those countries should follow. And then stability came of sorts with the countries joining of NATO alliance and becoming part of kind of routinized, institutionalized Western defense community. And by the way, as I already mentioned, some of it still very much continues and might be the essence of defense realities of those countries. But there's also a way of thinking about it, especially since 9/11 and the war in Iraq and President Trump's elections, to say that, yeah, that stability perhaps should be put in quotation marks. Is Western alliance stable? Isn't it fragmenting? is constantly in crisis. There's some noises in East Central Europe, including in Poland, that expect a future collapse of the Western defense community, and then some preparation for revising some of those older notions about European or East Central European oriented defense policies, or even strategic self-sufficiency. Noises about Poland, trying to get its own nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. And that's also a possibility. Well, let me make a pitch for the book itself. The book, so it's the first and only monograph on the topic, number one. Number two, for folks that might disagree with my judgments or Jim's judgments in terms of some conclusions in the book, the volume is chock full of information. In terms of budgetary figures, in terms of a narrative that summarizes the evolution of defense strategies of those countries, figures pertaining to the numbers of soldiers and the personnel effectives, and evolutions of those countries' defense policies and military policies and so on and so forth. In other words, the book can be a good basis of information, kind of besides and outside of the conceptual and theoretical framework and the conclusions reached by the authors. In other words, it's a good compendium about those countries' defense policies, kind of regardless where people stand with respect to their judgments. Number two, there is very extensive, perhaps too long, but comes with a warning, historical section. And both of us, Jim and I, felt that since we attach so much importance to strategic cultures, political cultures, so this whole notion that the past influences the present, that you cannot understand the values of defense policy elite and so on and so forth without taking consideration that those are Czechs and those are Poles and those are Hungarians, and they have a certain vision of the past that only they have, and it teaches them lessons. We felt like we need to have a good discussion of political and military history of those countries. And the reader will be able to find that history. So the book has lots of virtues. It's polyphonic. My chapters are different than Jim's chapters. We focus on slightly different issues, but it's also well integrated. We do try to follow the same conceptual framework. The conclusions are ours. The introduction is ours. The book is not too long. I think it could be a good source for both policymakers and scholars and students of the issue. I'm a big fan of the type of polka science that brings history and current issues together, the type of history which is conceptual, and the type of polka science which is historical. So for me, it comes naturally to exercise both sets of muscles. But going back to popularity of people like Snyder, I think people like a good story. Historians or historically oriented polka scientists have this unique ability to talk to mass public about contemporary issues in terms that mass public can understand. So much of polka science is jargon or terminology that kind of doesn't make sense without an extensive background. So because historians can tell a good story about the present and the past, they naturally find relevance. But it also tells you that history is important. There's a way to think as a polka scientist or international studies experts, which makes history relevant. And again, the concept then is culture. The notion is that values formed in the past have bearing on the present. In other words, it's not just storytelling, and it's not just every situation is unique, and then it becomes pure history or journalism. But there's also a notion that there's a way to kind of conceptually and systematically think about the present in the way that makes the past relevant. Number one. Number two, going back to Snyder, we live in interesting historical times again. There is something of a repetition of at least a sense of crisis that we used to have in the middle of the century. So historians who studied that great crisis that started approximately with World War I and ended, I guess, in 1989, but perhaps even earlier, World War II and World War I, kind of that period, they naturally find relevance. because we do have this sense of, again, that history is moving again, that there is perhaps a crisis in a global order. And we kind of want to look back at what happened when the crisis happened the last time. Thank you so much, William. Bye-bye.